There is a version of Graham Norton the world knows well. The grinning Irishman perched behind his desk, red sofa gleaming under the studio lights, coaxing A-list celebrities into stories they never planned to tell. He makes it look effortless. After more than 2 decades as one of television's most reliable Friday night companions, Norton has built a reputation as the chat show host who never cracks, never flinches, and never lets an awkward silence linger long enough to become painful. He is charm in a suit, wit on a timer, professionalism wrapped in the warmth of someone who genuinely seems to enjoy the company of strangers. But here is what the highlight reels don't show you. Behind every smooth broadcast is a host quietly working twice as hard as usual because the person sitting 3 feet away from him simply will not cooperate. There are the drunken ones who slur through stories that have no punchline. There are the sullen ones who answer every question like they've been subpoenaed rather than invited. There are the legends, the actual Hollywood legends, who arrive with decades of incredible stories locked behind walls of indifference. And then, in a category all his own, there is one man whose appearance on that famous red sofa Norton can now only look back on with something colder than frustration. At 62, with his career showing no sign of slowing down and his tongue considerably looser than it once was on these matters, Graham Norton has finally been open enough, across various festivals, interviews, and podcast appearances, to paint a clear picture of the guests who truly tested him. This is that picture. It is worth noting, before anything else, that Graham Norton has interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of celebrities. He has sat across from presidents and pop stars, from method actors and megastars who treat every press tour like a military campaign. He handles all of them with the same easy grace. So when he says that a particular guest was, in his own unambiguous words, hell, you understand that this is not a word he uses lightly. The guest was Mark Wahlberg. The year was 2013. Wahlberg was there to promote Broken City, and he shared the sofa that night with Michael Fassbender and comedian Sarah Silverman, both of whom arrived in full working order. Wahlberg, by the time the cameras rolled, was operating on a very different frequency. Speaking at the Henley Literary Festival in October 2025, Norton described exactly how it unfolded. Mark Wahlberg was a weird one because when he arrived, he didn't seem drunk. He told me about his film, told me a couple stories about stunts going wrong or whatever, and then it was only 15 minutes into the show when whatever the hell was in his system really took hold, and it was hell. What followed was the kind of television moment that audiences alternately found hilarious and deeply uncomfortable. Wahlberg repeatedly interrupted Sarah Silverman's story, moving down the sofa to grab her attention, before eventually getting up and sitting directly on Norton's lap, hugging the host and remaining there while Norton sat and laughed in visible discomfort. The audience wasn't sure whether they were watching chaos or comedy. The answer, from Norton's perspective, was simply chaos. The moment that completed the picture came later, when Michael Fassbender finally managed to hold the floor with a story. Norton later recalled thinking the story must be going particularly well because Wahlberg had gone quiet. Then he looked over and realized Wahlberg had fallen asleep on the sofa, mid-broadcast, in front of the live studio audience. "We didn't wake him," Norton said afterward. "We were delighted." Norton addressed the broader principle at the same Henley Literary Festival appearance. "If you ever see a drunk person on the show, it's because they've arrived drunk. We have not made that happen." It was a pointed clarification, and everyone in the room understood exactly who he was referring to. Wahlberg later brushed the episode off as a big night that got away from him, blaming jet lag and pre-show drinks for the chaos. Norton, being Norton, never publicly lit the match on an open feud. But when the question of worst guest arises, his answer comes without hesitation. Wahlberg. Every time. There is a particular kind of difficult guest that Norton finds perhaps more exhausting than the unruly ones. At least the unruly ones are present, in their way. They are generating energy, even if it is the wrong kind. The truly draining guests are the ones who have simply checked out entirely, who sit on the sofa like they've been sentenced to it. Mickey Rourke was that guest. Norton described the moment of arrival simply and memorably. "I just happened to be standing there when he got out of the car and he was holding a bottle of Jack Daniels, which is already worrying. But then we noticed the bottle of Jack Daniels was half empty. It soon became very clear where that Jack Daniels had gone." But unlike Wahlberg, whose drunkenness at least produced chaotic, unpredictable television, Rourke's version of intoxication manifested as pure, flat disengagement. He sat back on the sofa with his sunglasses on, answered questions with fragments and shrugs, and spent the portions of the interview not directed at him staring into the middle distance or fiddling with whatever happened to be in his hands. Norton, a man whose superpower is finding the human story inside anyone, found nothing to grab hold of. Mickey Rourke, he was just exhausting, Norton later told interviewers. He wanted to smoke all the time. I'd turn away for a second, turn back, and he'd lit another cigarette. It was so boring. You feel like a teacher taking children on a school trip, not a chat show host. The image is perfect and damning all at once. Graham Norton, one of the most naturally gifted conversationalists working in television, reduced to chaperoning a reluctant participant through a half-hour of television that felt considerably longer. Production staff spent significant time editing the episode into something presentable. Viewers still noticed the dead air underneath all the polish. Rourke, for his part, has never shown much interest in apologizing for any of it. He has spoken in various interviews about his disdain for the promotional circuit, for the performative cheerfulness he sees as a requirement of talk show appearances. To him, Norton's show represented a world of manufactured warmth that had nothing to do with the bruised, authentic image he had spent decades cultivating. Norton placed him firmly on a personal no-return list, and more than a decade on, that assessment has not changed. There is a specific agony to interviewing someone who is not rude, not difficult, not unprofessional, and yet somehow entirely unreachable. Kevin Costner gave Norton a masterclass in that particular experience. Costner, the stoic architect of films like The Bodyguard, Dances with Wolves, and Field of Dreams, arrived on the red sofa and proceeded to treat Norton's warm-up questions like obstacles to be cleared rather than invitations to be accepted. Every joke Norton threw into the air fell without a net. Every attempt at banter was met with the kind of measured, careful response that works beautifully in a press conference and dies completely on a chat show sofa. Norton described the specific texture of the frustration. I ask him a question and he looks at me like, Jesus, do I have to talk to this man? He gives a half-word answer. Then Helen Mirren asks him something and he lights up. That detail is key. It wasn't that Costner was incapable of warmth. It was that he was selectively deploying it, and Norton was not on the receiving end. Crew members present that evening remembered the audience's energy visibly dropping as the segment progressed. Norton has spoken about how certain formats simply do not work for certain personalities, and Costner represented a fundamental mismatch. The show runs on laughter, spontaneity, and the willingness to be caught slightly off guard. Costner's instinct, understandable in its own context, was to remain composed, considered, and largely impenetrable. Costner has hinted at his own perspective on this. Talk shows, he has suggested, often feel less like conversations and more like performances, and performance is what he prefers to do on a film set rather than a sofa. Norton understood the logic but found no comfort in it. There was no public exchange of grievances. There was simply a quiet understanding that they were not well suited to each other's company, and an invitation that never came again. If the Costner experience was frustrating, the De Niro experience carried the added weight of collapsed expectations. Because when Robert De Niro sits down across from you, you lean forward. Every person in that studio leans forward. The audience leans forward. The crew leans forward. You are in the presence of one of the most celebrated actors in the history of cinema, a man whose career contains multitudes, and surely, he has something extraordinary to say. He does not. Or at least, he chooses not to say it. Norton spoke about the experience at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, where he explained, he's not a storyteller, or very verbal. He's a benign presence. We were all leaning in, willing it to be amazing. What followed was a story that captures the experience precisely. De Niro began an anecdote, drew the room in, continued for what felt like a promising length of time, and then stopped. "Why am I telling this?" he said. Nobody had an answer. The segment was cut. Norton has hosted De Niro on the show on multiple occasions, which tells its own story about the gap between expectation and experience. Each time, the anticipation in the room is palpable. Each time, the reality is what Norton has described with diplomatic precision as a benign presence. Not hostile. Not deliberately unhelpful. Simply operating on an entirely different wavelength from the one required to make a Friday night chat show sing. De Niro's perspective, expressed elsewhere, is simple enough. He is not a talker by nature. He expresses himself through characters, through the stillness and precision of his performances, not through anecdotes polished for a studio audience. The two approaches are not just different. They are almost opposites. Norton's world demands openness, rhythm, the generous release of a good story told with timing. De Niro's world is built on withholding, on the power of what is left unsaid. When those two philosophies share a sofa, neither party is particularly well served. Norton remained gracious about it. But the weight of all that deflated expectation was something he has returned to in interviews more than once, always with that particular sigh that says more than the words around it. Graham Norton has a phrase he has used in discussions about his most difficult guests. He talks about guests who give you nothing. It is a precise and devastating description, because it captures something that goes beyond mere awkwardness. An awkward guest can be worked with. An awkward guest is still engaged with the situation, still responding to it, even if the response is stumbling or uncomfortable. A guest who gives you nothing is operating on a plane entirely separate from the interview happening around them. Daryl Hannah gave Norton nothing. When asked about his most difficult guest on the Kyle and Jackie O show, Norton described the Hannah experience without hesitation, noting that she had been extremely difficult to interview, giving one-word answers and seeming wholly disinterested in engaging with the process. By all accounts from those present during the taping, Hannah arrived withdrawn and tense, offering little in the green room and less on camera. Norton, whose instinct is always to seek the human being behind the celebrity, found a wall he simply could not scale. Every question was absorbed without response. Every gentle attempt to build momentum was gently deflected. The audience sat in an uneasy quiet, unsure how to calibrate their own reactions to something so far outside the normal shape of the show. Norton has spoken about the psychological toll of these kinds of interviews, the way a host begins to doubt himself, to wonder whether he has said something wrong, whether his approach is somehow broken. You start thinking, is it me? Did I say something wrong? He admitted at a live Q&A. Then came the clarification, but no, it was just nothing. She gave you nothing. Hannah has addressed her discomfort with the talk show format in broader terms, suggesting that the performative requirement to be charming and funny on cue has never felt natural to her. She was not, she has implied, refusing to engage out of arrogance. She simply could not do what the format requires. For Norton, whatever the underlying cause, the result was one of the most grueling stretches of television he has ever had to navigate. He has joked that the Hannah interview aged him by a decade. The joke lands because it doesn't feel entirely like a joke. And then there is Harvey Weinstein. Everything above this point describes difficult television. What follows describes something qualitatively different.